Hi. Oh, mine's not working.
I guess it's ringing. Oh,
Hi.
hello. How you doing?
Good, good.
Yeah, so you contacted me a while ago. I'm so sorry. Like I had to cancel the first time. It was just like my life's a mess sometimes. Let's leave it at that. About like reviews and debates. I don't really know how to start with this. This is my first time doing this. So you lead the way.
Sure. So basically I help people through any kinds of issues that they're having with like communication. So if that's a debate, that's one thing. If it's just like panels, I would consider that completely different. Or even in one-on-ones, like just discussions, those are going to be a little bit different. So we could take this a number of directions. We could start by talking about maybe what you felt like your characterization of your conversation with Destiny was, and we could start there. Or we could go into things generally, whichever one you want to do.
Okay. I'll start with expressing my biggest frustrations and
Mm.
then maybe we'll go from there. So the first thing is that sometimes I get very nervous when I'm in front of a larger audience. I'm not used to it. So I start articulating really poorly. Like I start saying like a lot. I start having an even like worse valley accent. And I think a lot of people view that as a weakness and poke fun at that or think that I am just illogical because of the way I speak. And then the second thing is that and it's not just with Destiny, it happens generally. Sometimes when I am trying to debate, I feel like I'm being kind of either strawmanned or misrepresented. I feel like at least I feel, maybe I'm obviously not presenting myself the best way. I feel like I try to come with a very like clear, simple position in the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so for example, when it came to Reed, what I was ultimately like trying to get at was this idea that her accusation is bigger than just her and Clinton. And since there's like multiple ways to argue for Clinton beyond that, um, we shouldn't argue with things like, okay, like does she go back and forth? Like, is there inconsistencies? Because that's something very common with most rape victims.
Mm.
That they might see themselves in that. So that's like what I was trying to get at, but obviously like I failed, period. Um I think also when it came to when we were talking about what is it, voting, I was trying to get to a similar clear point in my mind that I wasn't able to properly communicate about. Oh my God, wait, thank you so much for the 1,000 bits, Sample McCoy. That's pretty freaking darn awesome. Oh my God. Okay. So yeah. Um oh yeah, so then the second thing when we were having the conversation about voting, what I was ultimately trying to get at is that yes, voting is indeed like very important, absolutely. But so is protesting. Protesting not only like brings issues to light to voters, but it also, I would argue, put a certain amount of like pressure on politicians as well,
Mm.
to enact change faster than the next election cycle. Whether you can make an argument that that just ends up ultimately being an optic standpoint, oh, they're doing it because they think people won't vote for them. But the point is that that in itself is important. And even if it's small change, incremental change is all around important. Otherwise, you end up having this scenario or scenarios that a lot of accelerationists have that's like, okay, real change only happens when we tear down the government and institute it with like anarcho syndicalist things. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, okay, no, like what like if you're not going to count real change until like this next level or next level or next level, we might as well just say real change happens in small steps no matter what it is. We can say that this small change isn't enough, which absolutely isn't. We should push for more change all the time. We should always push to get better, but that doesn't, you can do that while not disaccounting the small change that happens. So yeah, I have like these ideas in my mind that I'm trying to argue,
Mm-hmm.
and they just get lost, and I fail at it, and I don't know how to improve it. Or I guess you improve it with practice, but I I just want to get better quicker, I guess. I'm not
Sure.
sure. So yeah, those are my general frustrations.
Okay. Um, so the very first thing you mentioned, where your frustration is kind of turning into like your accent coming out, or maybe like not handling the conversation as good, and then people start piling on, and then it kind of spirals out of control from there. That's something that like I think we'll put aside for a little bit, just because that would be harder. That's like keeping your cool and stuff like that. And I think that advice will all be in kind of like one vein. I think what might be more interesting to talk about are these points that you're bringing up. Are those things that you already have planned out to bring up for the conversation? Like, what is your stated goal before you go into a conversation like the Destiny one?
Well, a lot of times my goal is just to, and this is, I'm gonna relate this back to, I guess, how I might appear Weasley or might appear dishonest. I want to convince the other side to like see like the kind of believe what I'm believing through the line of logic and reasoning that I'm following.
Mm,
But I understand that, hey, you know what? My values don't always align with other people. My line of logic or reasoning might not relate to somebody else.
yeah.
So what I usually do is I try to find common ground first. I do this like with Republicans as well. Sometimes I let them slide in arguments I don't believe in because I'm looking at this overarching greater goal that I'm trying to reach to.
Mm,
And I think to a lot of people that appears like, oh, she doesn't have a real opinion or she's just being slimy. When it's like, no, I have my own opinions, but I don't think like arguing through that vein or through that lens will reach to me the ultimate goal that I want. And if you
mm,
ask my opinion point blank, I will give you my opinion point blank. I don't hide my opinions. Like I don't think I've ever hidden an opinion that I've had. I'm always like very blunt with them, only when I'm asked straightforwardly. But most of the time, I will try to use whatever values or things that the other person cares about to get there.
mm-hmm.
You asked me what are my, yeah, so those are my general goals. When I go into conversations with like Destiny, at least in the past, like I we were already texting beforehand, and like I like arguing in text format more than
Mm-hmm.
orally because it's harder to get lost, and it's you can be a lot more clear and concise in my opinion. But I usually don't come in like with a whole logic chart prepared or anything like that. He's just like, okay, like, come on and we'll talk about it. And I'm like, okay. And I kind of view it as a conversation, but I think that's not very smart for me to do because everybody else usually views it always like as a hardcore debate, which is, my fault because I should have realized that by now that that's a public perception.
Mm. But I think the other reason why, um, because like one thing that you noted that I would agree with is like you're willing to give concession on things that you may not necessarily agree with in the hopes of like being able to reach agreement on like a larger idea. Like not getting bogged down in the details of every single thing that you disagree with the person on, but like attacking a larger level and like trying to get agreement at like a larger level so you don't get bogged down in the details. Um, and I think that that is like a kind of like more of a conversational approach, right? Like in normal conversation, like you don't fight everybody on every single thing they say that's silly or like, not to your agreement or whatever. Whereas like in a debate, it's almost like people expect that every single line that a person is putting out is worthy of criticism and is worthy of like being picked apart. And so if they're able to see like issues or like things that they know you would disagree with and you're not, to them it can seem weird maybe because they're expecting a debate like you said. But that technique in itself, like applying it to a debate, means that like it will feel more like a conversational approach no matter what. Like I imagine even when you go into debates, because you're willing to give concession on these smaller items, does it like still feel to your audience or other audiences like it's a conversation even if you take the debate seriously?
Yeah, I think like always, well, I guess like my audience could answer that right now. I feel like I'm always trying to have conversations. Like I don't like unless if the person is like, I don't know, a freaking neo-Nazi or something. I think the vast majority of time people are what I was gonna say, like people don't want to be seen or feel as if they're like the bad guy. So if I want to create some sort of long-term change, I think that coming at it in a way of like, oh, I'm gonna attack you or I'm attacking you, will not actually change your mind. So what
Mm,
I try to focus on more is like I did this with mind waves. Like it was a debate, but I try to use like a Socratic method, the Socratic method to try to convey my arguments sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
So I do it like through a series of questioning the person and just, kind of letting like walking the person through their own logic by just continuously like asking them questions and things like that. So I think, yeah, for a lot of people it is conversational, and like they don't think that I'm aggressive enough, it seems.
Mm. Where do you think like this approach went wrong in the Destiny debate?
Um I think it's like a, what is it? A public viewing thing, right? If
Mm.
people, I think especially like with the way that YouTube videos are worded as like debates, it just backfires because it's like that's the mind frame people are going in. And when you see me not go hardcore or not, I don't know, like not seeming like I'm pushing back on everything, um or saying like I agree, because it's like, oh yeah, I generally agree, but then I'm saying like something different, but it's like, okay, yeah, like I generally agree with the idea, I just don't agree with like this approach or with that thing. It kind of like, I guess it comes out as just snaky or Weasley or whatever.
Mm. Hmm. Because like the Weasley thing, I think they're gonna put that label on you no matter what if you continue to choose to like make concession. And this is like a difficult thing because I picked this up in some of the comments on your other debates too, where it's like concession seems to get you a lot of criticism. And I don't think that it should, because I'm more of your mindset where I think that like attacking people oftentimes is not going to change their ideas, and like the lower the tension of the conversation you can keep it, the more likely it is they'll be responsive to the ideas you're putting out. um and so I'm not this may be like not satisfying for you, but I'm not entirely certain how you stop getting criticism for that from the audience. I don't know if Destiny would give you the same criticism for like making concessions on things. So if you're interested in that side of it, I think you don't have to worry too much. But as far as the audience, that's really hard because they're going to respond to that no matter what. If it doesn't fall into their expectations of a debate, then they can get really upset. The only thing I could think of to fix that would be to add some pretext to the conversation. Maybe at the very beginning, preface the whole thing with like, okay, so I just want to have a conversation. I understand you normally do debates. I'm not going to approach this like a debate. And if you start going that direction, I may remind you, because like all I'm trying to do is at first pick your brain about this thing and then find out where we can agree on like a larger picture for things. Because I know we're not going to agree on all the particulars. We may not even agree like in the steps that are going to come after wherever we agree, you know. But all I'm trying to get us to do is like figure out where we can say, oh, okay, we're on the same page with this. Oh, okay, we're on the same page with that. Because your focus here, right? You said it's to make them believe with like your own line of thinking, but that you've kind of like tempered that, and you've kind of started to just go for common ground because it's much more difficult to get them to both agree with something and agree with it exactly for the reasons that you agree with it. So it
Yeah,
seems like,
exactly.
mm, so
I've yeah, there's been like examples of like me with like lecture fan before, like way back, where we were having a conversation about climate change, and I knew that I wasn't able to convince him that climate change was real or whatever. So what I tried to convince him instead is that for, yeah, I don't remember the exact specifics of what happened, the details, but I think it's something along the lines of like, hey, you know what, like China is like a major competitor, like or we should try to focus on not having like more pollutants in the air, like trying to focus, okay, maybe not climate change exactly, but on this idea of like, hey, you know what, there's pollution still exists, you agree that pollution exists, we should try to
mhm.
like improve that for ourselves. You don't like China, you think China's like a bad country or whatever. We can take like you can take national pride in this idea that like the United States is being the forefront of like this clean energy movement, things like that.
Mm,
So even if it's not something that like what does national pride even mean? Like, I'm Puerto Rican, like I have Puerto Rican pride and not like American pride. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I still try to pull on those strings, on those heartstrings, I guess.
Mm. I like that that's your approach because personally, I've had a really tough time with figuring out how to give advice to people that want to go into a conversation to agree rather than argue. Um, because so many of these people, they're either that I've spoken to are either going on panel shows or even in their one-on-ones. Entertainment is a large part of it, and they want it to get spicy. So this is actually going to be really fun for me. I hope we could talk like in the future, and I could get feedback on how this advice works out for you. But because we have similar goals going into conversations. So personally, I agree with you that when we go into a conversation, seeking agreement and figuring out what places where, like, what pieces of, I like to think of it as like pieces of a puzzle, right? Like, we're trying to find, oh, okay, that's really cool. He agrees that there's pollution, like, pollution exists. Like, well, this changes the game because now I know that there's something that's like on his game board as well. Like, we both have pollution on there, so I can work with that. Let me find a few other things. Like, oh, okay, he agrees that the US is on the forefront of this green movement and that coming up with like new green technologies. Like, that's cool. Okay, how do I like play these things together? I don't know if you're going to be successful in every single conversation from the get-go, but I think because of the approach you're taking, if you do notes while you're having the conversation and you review that with your chat later, I think you could get like exponentially better at these conversations because you're actually building like a structure underneath your argument that's going to help you with every single person you talk to. Because the more things you figure out about them that you can agree with, the bigger the arguments you can make are because you understand that person a lot better. Whereas the people that approach these debates as only arguments and they're only looking to see why the other person is wrong, people are constantly changing their opinions to like not be wrong, but they're not often changing these like points of agreement that you're looking at because there's no reason to. So I actually think if you take notes on all of your talks and then you review the parts where you agreed, you'll get better every single conversation. And it may just be that like you are playing the race as like a turtle and just not a hare. Um, does that make sense so far, or am I sounding crazy?
No, it makes sense.
Mm.
I have a problem, and I guess like I don't like talking about this in particular because I think sometimes people think that I'm coming across as like somebody who's trying to act like super smart or something like that. But I don't have much experience taking notes.
Mm-hmm.
Throughout high school and even college, and I just like blame it on an ADD thing or whatever. Like I would just like remember my material like orally. Like if the teacher taught it, I would just like remember for the next class and everything like that, and for like the test and the essays and everything. So I'm really bad with taking notes because I've just like I've never really done it. So I'm not really sure like how do you start when you're taking notes? Like, do you just the main points of what the other person says, or what do you think I should focus these notes around? Like, I know you said points of agreement, but I guess I'm asking you more like a structure, like, oh, what common ground, a disagreement, major idea. Like, how would you suggest that maybe I should try to organize or structure these notes?
Mm. This is really awesome because do you know who Aiko Rules is?
I do not.
Okay. Basically, she has OCD and ADD, and so we did a whole stream with her on if you're taking notes for conversations or for arguments, what kinds of things should you be taking notes on? And for Aiko, because she also didn't have a lot of experience with like debates or even conversation more generally outside of like her work, she kind of was in an interesting situation where we had to talk about notes in the abstract. But for you, because you debate all the time, I get to be more specific. Awesome. So as far as what things you should be taking notes on, since your whole shtick here is agreement, I can just tell you exactly what I take notes on. So what I'm taking notes on are everything is structured as remember words. So those are words where when I look at them or I read them in my head, because we kind of work similarly there too, where like everything for me is all like auditory and oral as far as like my memory. What I do is when I read the word in my head, I'm able to remember like, oh yeah, that's that argument that he had. So every time somebody's telling me something where I'm like, oh, I agree with that, or oh, I think I can turn that into something useful later. Like, oh, that's interesting that they mentioned that, or that's important to them. So if I can make an anecdote that will stick with them more, that will use something they mentioned, or like if they mention a city that I've been to or something like that, oftentimes, even if that's not necessarily related to my argument, having it in front of me is super helpful because I can't view or listen to all of those thoughts at once. So when they're on the paper and they're all outlined there, like I get a snapshot of the person that I'm speaking to and how the conversation has developed. So with these remember words that are supposed to be triggers for these memories of the arguments that they made, I kind of go through the whole paper in order. Next to ones that are positive, I'll put a plus. Next to ones that are negative, I might put a minus. Like, oh, okay, he said this
Mm-hmm.
thing, and I really don't agree with that. Like, that's now a problem in this conversation that I aim to fix. So I'm just going to put that to the side. And more specifically on problems, if anybody can give you a problem that you have a solution to and you can plug that into your conversation, that helps to show them that you're on this page of agreement and that you're listening at a different level too. So that might be something helpful. Like if they mentioned that like they had a technical problem in Twitch or something like that and you have an answer to it, anything little like that, I like mentioning as well. Anything where like we can connect in some way, because your whole approach to this is going to be agreement. It's going to be keeping the tension of the conversation really low, making sure this doesn't really turn into a debate, that this stays as a conversation where you kind of have access to their thoughts so you can, sift through them for gems of agreement. Um, so
Yeah.
I actually think you're in a better position to argue than other people, although it's not going to be as performative maybe, but I think you'll get really good at this. Have these notes made sense so far?
Yes, yes. Actually, it reminds me of Model United Nations. I used to participate very heavily in debate, and I remember that like I wouldn't really write notes for my speeches, but I would write words, like a single word or like two or three words that had to do with what my speech was going to be about. So it brings memories to that, and it's really cool thinking about like incorporating that into my future like conversations on Twitch. Absolutely, I think that's something that it works and is realistic for me as well, because I know that if I had to write like these long sentences or these long phrases, I would just get too distracted. I wouldn't be able to
Mhm.
listen and like remember what the person was saying and then have it down, if that makes any sense.
Yes,
Um
100%.
so yeah, that's a really good strategy. Um I guess like and this is like kind of separate from taking notes and everything like that. But it has to do with like keeping the tone down, with keeping the level of heat in the conversation down.
Mhm.
And it's this idea that I'm really bad once things start getting escalating. Once things
Mm.
escalate, I just it's almost game over for me. In the sense that it's really hard for me to try to bring it back down to zero. Like when somebody puts it at a 15, I end up going 15 as well. When somebody puts in 20, then sometimes I go to like a 23, and it just like keeps going higher and higher and higher. And do you I guess what I'm trying to say is, do you have any recommendations of how to pull that back?
Mm.
Because I just I get lost. I let it go hell, like loose.
Yeah. So it would depend on how quickly and what techniques you have for get like regaining your composure. So like if you were able to like hit pause on the entire conversation, how quickly are you able to like get your cool back, and like what needs to happen for you to bring down that percentage?
Um, I don't know. This is so weird because it relates to like what I'm actually talking to my therapist about and everything like that.
Mm.
Of like learning how to calm down anxiety. Because usually I just have to take a step back. And like literally take a step back, like try to meditate, self reflect, and everything like that. But that's really hard to do in the middle of, I guess, like a debate or a conversation. You can't like just suddenly pressing the exit button is a really bad it's a tough thing to do. And not just that, it makes you look really bad. It makes you look like, oh, you just couldn't think of anything back, or you're just being a giant baby. Um so I'm not really sure about in the middle of everything.
Mm. So these options for you are going to like, be all over the place as far as ethics. So it depends on kind of like what your style is, but here's a few different things you could do. So if you just need a second and you can still listen to the other person talk, and all you need to do is like not feel like you're put on the spot to have a response, anything you can do to get the other person talking will be positive. So if I feel like I'm lost, like, or I don't feel like I have enough information, even like towards the beginning of this conversation, I asked a lot of questions because like I don't have enough to like figure out where things should go. Like I wanted to hear more to figure out where some specific problems were from your perspective, and then to handle them in that way. Which again is why I'm really happy that we're having this conversation, because it sounds like we approach things sort of similarly. So if I need some time to chill out, or to regain my composure, or to think about things, aside from actually asking for a second to think about something and writing stuff down and taking a look at my notes, the other thing that you can do is ask questions or get the other person to talk however you want. There's a lot of easy ways to do that. So asking them to explain a point that they had given you before, especially if it was a point that upset you, that maybe you think you gave like undue criticism to, maybe, or just asking another question about that. Just letting them have the floor and letting them talk more will kind of let them work through whatever, because usually the reason why you're going to have your frustration increase is because that other person is pushing it too. So if you can let them talk themselves into like calming down a little bit and feeling like they're heard, for a lot of people that'll chill them out, and at the same time that gives you some time to compose yourself. If you need to, you can always turn them down on the mixer on your end a little bit. You can take a second, do some breaths. This is why I asked, like, it depends on how long and what you do, because we could plan around that. But basically, giving the floor to the other person is a really, really easy way. That's one. There's there's plenty of other ones, like I don't think I'll go into them because they're unethical. But
Mm-hmm.
does that one sound like it works?
Yeah, no, that one sounds like it works. I guess. Oh shoot, I was gonna say. So yeah, so I guess that makes sense. I don't know if you had to deal with this before, but what do you do when you feel like somebody is just straw manning you, or trying to, I guess, debate not in good faith? Because I've had that experience before, and it's really frustrating. Because you're, and I think it's the reason why a lot of people call me naive as well. Because on one hand, I'm trying to understand the person. I'm approaching it in a conversation type of manner,
Mm-hmm.
and it feels like they're purposely not listening to me, or purposely trying to take what I say and take it to like an extreme and like lose all nuance in it. And I don't know what to do in those scenarios, because
Mm.
I can say, "Oh, you're bad faith" or whatever, but that doesn't come across as like good. A lot of times, it comes across as like, "Oh, just trying to scapegoat your way out of the conversation." And I could also choose to leave the conversation, but as I said before, it ends up with just more criticism on my part because I left. And it goes as a thing of like, "Oh, haha, like, she can't handle it, she lost," or whatever. So
Yeah.
I don't know what to do when you're stuck in that position like that.
Yeah. I guess we could start with like how you could possibly avoid that. And I know that's going to seem like backwards and maybe rude, but like one thing that you can do, and I do see you make efforts to do this, but I think you could improve upon it, is like always making sure that when you're giving your own point, it's completely wrapped in like the kind of, it's completely wrapped in the wording of the other person. So like and this may be difficult to do as well. When I go into conversations, I try to wait until the other person has given me enough details about their own position that I can like word my position 100% with like the terms and everything else that they've given me. And that tends to like increase my success rate of getting people to like not bite back on stuff that I feel like they should agree with. So making an effort to only give out the arguments that like you can word in the words of the other person. So like for instance, if somebody is telling me if I'm asking them questions, I'm like, you agree gun violence is bad? Yeah, yeah. And you agree that like the police could use some reform? Yeah, of course. Like, of course they could use some reform. Of course it's not great now. And like, I would avoid certain things like the racial part of it, because for certain people that are anti-BLM, as soon as you get into the racial part, like you've hit an iceberg and you're going to lose it with them. So avoiding those sorts of things, and then asking questions enough that like, okay, now we have a path painted to like get to my argument. So then I'll go through all of the things that I agreed with them with. And this is where the notes are really helpful. So I'll like start circling the parts that are useful, and then I'll go, okay, so let me backtrack through what we've gone through so far, and then I'll kind of go into like what I want to talk about. And they're like, okay, sure. So we talked about this, and you definitely agreed with that. Yeah. And then because of that, this happens, right? Yeah, of course. And then that leads to this. Yes. And so when I reach that point, my perspective is that we could go in this direction. I understand that you want to go this direction because of these next 3 steps, but I don't think you've considered this one. And then like, oh, okay, like, well, we've at least made it all the way to this point where we're diverging, like following exactly what they've said. So all of the logic up to that point leads to what they're saying. That's the most like clear way of doing that. So basically only make the argument with the points that they've given you. Oh man, your chat is crazy.
What? Did somebody? Yeah, sorry, I didn't pay attention to chat when I'm
no
talking.
worries. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. There's a giant dong.
Okay.
Hold on. I'll put that over here. Shoot. So yeah, basically, wrapping up your argument in the words of the other person is really helpful and can avoid getting to that point. But once you're at that point, any of these exercises where you're kind of letting them talk and like clearing the air a bit is helpful. Sometimes a soft restart is fine too. Like if you want to take a moment to think, or a moment for them to talk about something, let there be a pause, like let there be a long pause, and then change the topic. Be like, okay, and what would you think about this? And then start in a new direction. That's always fine. And I would say that's preferable to like a hard reset on the conversation leaving. So like no matter what, a soft reset like that, where you let some open air, you let it hang, maybe ask them a question before, and then start in a new direction, that can be a lot better than having to leave. And then there were the techniques we talked about before for like bringing the tension back down. But if it gets to a point where you think they're being bad faith and stuff like that, they kind of force you into a position of only using their arguments, which is why starting from the beginning with that technique will be really helpful, especially for people that frequent debates. Because some people, they are only looking to tear you down and only looking to push their ideas. They are not looking for agreement, and that is not one of their primary concerns. So like it's tough to deal with those people. I think the only way is to like strangle them with the rope that they gave you in a video game, basically. And I would say that is that helpful, or is that like, not?
No. I think it is helpful. It's just hard to conceptualize in a sense. So like, I guess like something easier said than done, right? To kind of do a soft reset. But then when you're there in the moment with all the heat and stuff, and you're like, okay, let's go back down to the beginning. Oh, and this goes to something else. Sometimes I feel like I'm being like led by the nose, if that makes any sense. That I'm trying to go down this pathway, and then it gets derailed, or it gets taken to a different extreme that wasn't in my original plan at all. And then suddenly I'm stuck between like answering the question that's not really trying to go with like the line of logic that I'm trying to follow. And I understand maybe that's a person trying to counter, but at the same time it doesn't feel like counter. It seems like starting just like a new branch in conversation where we're not even done with the first one.
That can be hard to pick up on in the moment, I think. Like, do you feel like you're able to pick up on when that's happening in the conversation, or is this something you don't realize until like the trap is kind of sprung?
Yeah, it's done something until I realize, until like 2 or 3 questions in, and I'm like, wait a second, we're like, this isn't what the previous line of logic or thinking or reasoning I was going down with. Now like I have to defend myself on like this completely different line, or this completely like different set of variables.
Yeah, because it's hard to see that coming, because if they plan to push you into that corner, it can be difficult to like see that trap coming when you're in the middle of it. Um it, I think defining what your goal is before moving into the conversation might help ground you a bit more. So we talked before about how you're kind of going for common ground. Um but maybe having like one or two objectives as far as like things that you want to get across or things that you want to learn more about might help you keep grounded in those situations. So like if they start asking you these weird questions and you realize you're in a weird place, taking a moment to like reframe or go back to those things might give you like a direction to go. So like the way that this could be helpful is like, oh, okay, I'm in this weird space. They're asking me all these weird questions. This totally isn't the argument I was going to make. And they've like accused me of saying something that I didn't at all mean to say. So, like, now that I'm here, what the heck do I do? If in front of you, you had written that like the goal of this conversation was to reach agreement on something like basic police reform, then you can go, okay, well, I think all cops are bad right now. And that's obviously like not what I think. Somehow we've ended up here. I don't know how we got here. And like at this point, I'm in a trap. You could always restate like your purpose for the conversation too. And sometimes that can be a powerful way of getting out of that. So just going, okay, like, I'm not saying we're going to agree on everything. I don't even know how we got to this point in the conversation. Like my main goal here is just to figure out, can you like believe in this, or like can you go this direction, or like I'm just trying to show you the merits of this system. That's one way, but it comes off as like kind of like this is the tough thing is also for female streamers. I feel like people unfortunately treat you guys way different.
I think like that. Yeah, I struggle with that because on one hand I'm thinking like, oh no, like under just that it's just in my mind. But I've had more than one person be like, oh yeah, like this is they're holding you to a standard that they don't hold like any other male streamer to. So I'm not sure.
Yeah, because I was about to say, but that's going to look like running away with you. And unfortunately, I think it's because of how some people are treated on here. Um, this is hard because once that trap is sprung, it's really difficult because you've already kind of taken the brunt of like the negative optics from them getting you to that point. That's actually a really hard situation. I'm going to take a note of that and think about that later. If I figure out something, I'll definitely let you know.
Yes, please.
Do you,
Yeah.
is that typically fast paced, or does that sometimes happen slowly?
It's typically fast paced. It's
Mm,
typically like, I'm trying to follow like through a line of reasoning, and then they ask me a question, and then like I respond to the question, and then they ask me another one, and then suddenly like we're not going through the first line of reasoning. I'm suddenly defending something like completely different, or we're talking about like a subject that's like similarly related, but it doesn't follow the line of reasoning in my opinion, if that makes sense. Like
yeah.
the line of reasoning is A to B, B to C, C to D, and that's what we're trying to follow. And then they're like, okay, but what about Y that is sometimes related to A? And then it's like, whoa, 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 like, wait a second.
Yeah.
And then it's like I answer it because I can see like the relation kind of. I can see like
Hmm.
the string, but it's still a string. It's not like a rope, and it ends up derailing it. But then if I
Yeah.
don't answer it, or if I try to like say, oh, I'll answer that later or whatever, I feel like people will just like claim the worst of me. But at the same time, it's like people are gonna claim the worst of me no matter what. Like I've
Mm.
already like hit that.
Yeah. Because I've noticed that this happens a lot of the time if people are able to like fast talk you. Like if they just like quickly give you some points and whatever, and it's quick enough that like, especially if you're not taking notes, like you can very easily be lost in like what they're pulling out of this. Since you're going for agreement, I tend to look at everything, like I said, puzzle pieces from the other side. And part of that also is like, what are they getting out of me? Like, what points am I giving them? Any response that I give people, I tend to also write down with like a word or two and just put a circle by it so I know it's from me. Because there have been times too, especially talking with Destiny, where I've been like, like I see how some of the things that I'm saying could be like turned around in a weird way. So I'm going to have to like, avoid this. But if I didn't have notes, I would have been screwed. He would have got me on like a few points. And that's not to say that he's the one that actually does this all the time. This happens with like a lot of people.
It happens with everybody, or
Yeah,
like the vast majority of people.
yeah. Like if you let them go quick, they know their point. So as long as they can get you to say the things they need to paint you a certain way, especially if their chat already has seen this happen before, like they're primed and ready, and they're just gonna make that happen. That's tough. Yeah, I'm gonna think more about that one.
Yeah, I feel like, and I just kind of sucks because when you're talking to like the person, and even if you sometimes feel like the other person understands you, like if the rest of the audience doesn't understand you, then they're gonna paint your point as something completely different. So I guess that's something else that I really struggle with, because sometimes I feel like the other person understands what I'm saying and they get where I'm coming from, but then it's like the audience doesn't understand it at all. And like I'm going to reference back to, or the audience doesn't understand it to the best of the ability. And I think that's a fault in myself. So for example, when I was having a conversation with Mind Waves and Destiny and everything, I was trying to get these points across super badly. I was like just trying my hardest to communicate them, and like Mind Waves wouldn't understand what I was saying. But then
Mm-hmm.
when Destiny translated it, he would understand, like, then he would understand. So maybe that's just a practice thing. Maybe that's just something that you're never going to get better with until you practice more and more. But I wonder if there's any specific terminology or just like phrasing that I use that makes things sound a lot more complicated than what they should be.
Well, from my perspective, having watched at least the Destiny one about police, it seemed like you didn't have a super good idea of like why he was coming to the conclusions he was coming to, because I think if you would have had a better understanding of like some of the fundamentals that are leading him to his conclusions, you could have used those, or at least been wary of them and how they were going to like diffuse what you were trying to put across. So like one thing that became very clear towards the end of the conversation was like this voter apathy angle. And by starting with and putting a ton of value on the voter apathy thing, you can be all of a sudden your opinion changes completely. So if you take like a base human being with like a basic understanding of political whatever, and then you put them in an argument and tell them voter apathy is the number one concern with the why the police departments haven't changed, like all of a sudden, yeah, you can start shitting on the protests. Like you can do a lot of stuff. Like some of the things that were the main drivers behind his opinion on stuff needed to have been diffused before you would be able to make progress on stuff. The other thing I would say, like specifically from that conversation, let me try to think. One of them was trying to get him. I'll go with the protest one because I feel like that should be the easiest. Where like he was kind of saying stuff along the lines of like the protests aren't doing anything. They've done what they're going to do, and this is like the end of it. And it's like, well, hold on, that's like a really doomery take. Like that should definitely require like some pushback. I think the easiest way to push back against it would have been to have more reforms on hand, ready about stuff, and to then also
Mm-hmm.
have the dates for those, so you could be like, well, no, like when this first started at the peak of it, we only had these things done, and now these things are being passed. These things are work in progresses. So like, no, I reject the notion that this is the end of this or that it hasn't done anything, because both of those are like, you know, like I can just prove them false by like Googling it. So that's a bit crazy, Destiny. And like that may have taken him aback a bit. Because the other thing you can do is have all these factual things ready, but they're not like part of your style. I don't think they're something you would use a bunch. But when people get prickly or they start being bad faith, or they overextend, that can be a really interesting jab in response to that, because people make themselves vulnerable when they overextend. And I often see that they're willing to do that with people who they don't think are going to be able to like hit back against them. Like seeing that some of the debate people go up against people who are soft spoken or maybe have more of a like conversational sort of approach to debates. I see them overextend on arguments that I know for sure they wouldn't do with other people, and like that was one of the ones with Destiny where I'm like, yeah, I don't think he would have said that to other people. I don't know. That would have been easy to punch back at. And if you hold back those kind of statistical arguments, or like arguments where you have them very fleshed out with like a bunch of
Evidence, yeah.
yeah, that can be helpful, and it makes you look better too. Like if you can pull one of those out in the very beginning and one of those out in the end, that can be a good sandwich to like, you know, while I'm approaching this really nicely, like under the surface of this, I've researched my stuff, and you do, like, you spend a ton of time on this. I don't doubt that like whipping one of these up wouldn't be too much of a problem. But yeah, just having like a list of them for points like that, because he's not the first person to have said that. I see a lot of other people going that way, and like, if I were in your position, that would have been one of the things that I would have prepped before going into that. I wouldn't have expected him to use it, but it would be something that I would have. So statistical arguments are a good way to attack these bad faith things, if possible, like in that situation. Because some of these things are like way easy to divert the conversation too with a statistical argument. So if you say, if somebody like accuses you of saying all cops are bastards or whatever, like there are statistical arguments you could pull out where it's like, well, they're also like committing this much percentage of crime, this percentage of them gets off the hook, like there's this that, use all the statistics that prove that there's a problem in the police department, and then go like, so like, you know, you belittling like the movement that I'm trying to be a part of and I'm trying to support, like almost seems like you're pretending there's not a problem here, and it seems dismissive and getting off topic. So I would prefer if we could just stick on these points that I came here to talk about today, and then go back to the main arguments that you have for the conversation that we talked about earlier.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Like this what I've started doing is on my Discord, I've started compiling like all the studies or resources I start using when I debate or talk conversations with, because I know them in my head, but it's true, like I don't feel like I have the confidence to cite them if I don't have them on hand in that second. So I definitely think that's something that I'm going to like do more and more often. Because, you know, I think like in the back of my mind when I was even having that conversation, it was like, okay, like Breonna Taylor's law that passed put like major restrictions when it came to no knock warrants, which can like potentially save so many lives. Just like having a blatant ban on chokeholds. I remember somebody sending me like a study that I think reduced it incredibly, like 70%. And is this enough? Like, no, I wouldn't say it's enough, but oh my God, it's a lot more than what we had beforehand.
Yeah.
Like, it's better than nothing. And not to mention, like, this is, I think, like the third week of protest. Like, if you want to see long-term reform, it takes like long-term protesting as well. So the fact that you get these things after like a week or two of protests is huge. Like,
yeah,
civil rights isn't something that we got until literally years and years of protests. So it does say something. So yeah, I definitely think that's something that I have to keep in mind and that I have to incorporate more for sure.
In that specific conversation, this is what you were just talking about actually made it click in my head. The way that Destiny arrives at like reform actually getting passed is he thinks that that's only due to the vote, and he doesn't necessarily connect protesting leading to voting. And that was like a really, really big problem in that conversation that I don't think ever got addressed, is that like you are very convinced that like protests lead directly to like larger reforms because protests lead to voting, lead to reforms. But like his idea was that the jump from protests to like people actually going out to vote is very small, and thus the effect it has on reforms will necessarily be very small. That was one little thing that kind of ran through the whole conversation and made it like really difficult for you to talk to each other. Is that something you picked up on at all, or would you phrase it differently?
Well, that's something I actually asked him about afterwards. And like I asked him point blank, like, do you think protests are helpful in any way? And then he responded, oh yeah, because protest leads to like more voting. But then when we were arguing, like it didn't come across that way to me.
Yeah. Because it did seem like his implication was that like you're focusing on the protest. I don't think you should focus on the protesting because it's one step behind. We need to focus on the vote, and the real problem is voter apathy. And no amount of protesting is going to solve voter apathy. And it's like, well, the point of the protest is not to solve voter apathy. So that's a silly statement. Like that's a silly direction to take this. It's very strange. But yeah, it definitely seemed like it was different. Yeah, if you asked him after and he said that would make sense. And I do believe that that's what he would believe, although it seems like he was arguing that like it's minuscule and that, you need to have other things to focus on voter apathy. Again, that brings it back to like I think that conversation should have been more about like sorry, a bunch of people are sending stuff. I think that it should have been more so about voter apathy, because that would have been something you had to disconnect from the protests really quick. Like, yeah, okay, Destiny, I get it. Voter apathy is a big problem for sure, but like this thing isn't going to solve. Like the protests are not meant to solve voter apathy. So to measure them on that metric is really strange, because that's not what their purpose is at all. And if you're saying instead of protesting, we should be solving voter apathy, I would say these are things that can happen in tandem and are not really related.
That's been something that's been driving me crazy with so many people I've been having like these conversations with, and like not just Destiny. I don't want people to feel like I'm like bad talking him or like just like going like on him or anything like that. But with so many people I've argued with, like they're like, okay, but like voting, and I'm like, you can do these two things in tandem. Like they're not. You can do direct action and voting, and both are very important. And to say like, oh no, voting is like the most important compared to direct action or compared to protesting, it's like they're both symbiotic organisms. To say that it's I would say like it's borderline faulty, if not faulty, to separate one completely from the other. They both feed into each other, they both like help each other. So I think like a lot of people have like this view that like, oh no, like it like a hierarchy in a sense. And to me it's like, no, like there maybe you can say like voting is slightly more important, but protest is necessary in a sense to be able to spur that, to be able to spur pressure, change, to get people like more knowledgeable about what's going on, things like that. So it just it's weird, because I just think a lot of people, I guess it makes sense why they would want to make it more hierarchical, or why they want to make it just like completely separate boxes, because I guess it's more spicy.
Yeah. And the other thing, if we're looking at this in terms of like steps on the road to an argument, we at least agree with him on voting leading to reforms, right? Like that's not disputed. He would agree that like voting is what leads to reforms. The contention he has is that protesting leads to voting. So what we could do is we could add extra steps in between there to prove or to make more clear how protesting directly impacts voting. So like one thing that Destiny says a lot or speaks on a lot is the importance of mainstream media in influencing a large swath of like moderate voters and just voters in general, right? So one direction to take would be to again work from his perspective first. So like, okay, well, like if protesting doesn't influence voting, like don't you talk all the time about how like the news is influencing voting, and how like mainstream media is the go-to for so many people about like how to vote and what the issues are, et cetera, et cetera. And like he'll have to concede that because he said it before, and if he fights on it, then you go to any other argument that he's had where he's used that and you go, well, no, because you've said that here and here, so why doesn't it apply here? And then once he concedes that, then you go, okay, well, would all of these issues about BLM or about police reform or any of this other stuff, would that have been covered for so long on the mainstream media if there weren't massive protests all across the globe about it? Like, it's very difficult and weird to like take the approach of separating protests from like voters or voter turnout, or like even what ends up on the ballot or what's on the forefront of politicians' minds. Like another thing he kept saying was that like, well, the constituents, they're going to look to their constituents, and if none of your people are voting, then you're not their constituents. It's like, yeah, but they also play to the media, and the media destroys them because their voter base is super susceptible to mainstream media stuff. Like that's why they're careful about like, you know, this, that, and the other thing as far as like looking bad or looking good, or, you know, like you don't have to sell them on the importance of optics in politics. So, you know, when there's giant protests and their city looks bad and their police are fighting and whatever, like regardless if they're convinced those people are going to show up to the polls, I think it's safe to say that they're going to go into elections wary about that. And that wariness, whether it ends up reflecting in like actual reform, or it's actually just being more careful about who they elect in next time as like chief of police, or like the millions and millions of ways that the protest has like made its way into the minds of politicians, is mostly due to the fact that like they happen and the fact that they were covered so broadly. So like that would be a strong argument to get around that. But finding where he's not making the same connection you are, in this case between protesting leading to voting, and then figuring out the other steps you have to add in between, or another approach to, start building on that, I think would be what you have to do. But that's exactly the strategy you've already told me you engage in. So just applying that there may have produced that answer.
Yeah, no, I think that's yeah, for sure. You've given me a lot of good advice so far. I'm not taking notes, but I'm remembering all of it. I swear. We're not debating, so it's okay.
No problem. I'm happy I can help in some way.
Yeah. Do you have any like specific critiques about like what I do that we haven't covered yet that you think I could improve on?
Um, it's counter to your purpose, but I think being more willing to hold your ground on stuff would be good. But again, I really feel like giving that with a grain of salt, because again, I feel bad saying this, but like women are treated differently. So it's like a way different ball game to like stand your ground on something without like being called bitchy or this or that, or like, I don't know. It's really hard. Like I would say to stand your ground more, but I don't know how much that actually ends up benefiting you compared to like not making it known that you're super upset about stuff and then just like constantly listening for where you can fit in your argument. But that sounds really like lame.
Yeah, it feels a little bit like overwhelming sometimes because I get so many people like telling me so many different things. So I have like 100 comments that are like, oh, she's like a weasel or a stink or whatever, she has no spine. And then I have like a bunch of other comments saying like she's so stubborn and like bullheaded, and she like, she's incapable of like learning new ideas or anything like that. So it's really hard because I feel like no matter what approach I take, I lose. Like it's so frustrating.
Um yeah, because like it also depends on the circumstance. Like in one-on-one conversations, I think you can do this a lot better without like looking bad. But like in the panel shows, like I guess that's a whole different beast. In your one-on-one conversations, yeah, holding your ground on stuff actually becomes difficult. So I'll take that back. What are things that I feel like are difficult? Well, the concessions thing initially was a point I wanted to talk to you about. Like, if I'm being super transparent, I could just like read what my first take was after watching the whole thing. So
Go for it. Go for it.
so before hearing anything about your positions on stuff, I wrote that my take was that she goes into this conversation in the hopes of getting his validation of the police idea after receiving strong pushback from him. Felt like she was allowing compromise on almost every level in hopes that he'd concede the legitimacy of defunding, or at least stepping outside of the current police structure with chief, officers, etc. He felt there were far more effective and less radical alternatives to solve these issues and push back hard, finally pointing to voter apathy as the main problem, which unfortunately allows you to shit on the protesters, further upsetting Pxie. So that was basically my take. But I think that saying the thing about the concessions at different levels and the compromise thing for validation is not necessarily correct anymore, because now I understand more of what you were going for. That like you're looking to reach points of agreement so that you can paint a larger picture for your ideas, or that you can at least have them arrive at your conclusions in like a logic of their own style, because yours doesn't always work for people. And so like again, this is why I like talking to you guys, because I get a better understanding. But does anything from that give you any info or?
Yeah, no, it does definitely give me information. Because I think that's how a lot of people see it as well. Like, oh no, like she's just like trying to like bend for his will or whatever. And it's like, no, like I just don't think that it's worth like time or effort trying to split like one hair in half when there's like a larger conversation to be going on here.
Yeah.
But I definitely agree with you that I have to identify more like the key components that are worth holding your ground on. Oh wait, sorry, thank you. It's your boy Tipster for rating with a party of 44. That's pretty freaking lit. Thank you. But yeah, it's like really frustrating in that sense. That I think I have to get better at recognizing like what main points I should push back on, and not like sacrifice, even though I'm still trying to get that bigger picture.
Mm. Hmm. Yeah, I mean, like, well, now that you know I'm totally biased in favor of you, I would totally agree. I think it's fine to make a bunch of concessions as long as you are able to, like, get your main point in. Because, like, the concessions you make now, if they actually end up being problematic, could just be, like, the purpose of future conversations. Again, I think that your game is the turtle rather than the hare. Like, yours is going to be a slower game, but it's going to be, like, building momentum and having like a greater understanding of everybody so that like when future issues come up, whether the next issue is about police or it's about climate or it's about this or it's about that, like because you've been building this understanding of other people, fitting in agreement is going to be easier over time. So being okay with letting certain things go, but taking note of them means that like later on, if you're like, oh, I want to have a talk with Destiny, like I wonder what we'll talk about. You don't have to go for the drama stuff all the time either, or like topics that are going on. Like you could also just look back on your notes and be like, yeah, he said this weird thing that like I let it slip because we wanted to talk about one thing and it seemed unrelated, but I guess now we could talk about this. Like, so you could do that, just like keep notes of the things that you were able to let go, and I think that's fine because you can always address them later. I think focusing on the agreement is actually a really positive thing. It's probably going to be more effective if you have a few like goals in mind before you start the conversation, and if those are at the top of your notes, if you start using notes, that can be really helpful to ground you and like really helpful for like keeping the conversation in the right lane. Like it's more apparent to you when you start veering off or when they're asking weird questions because you'll be like, hold up, this totally isn't the reason I came here. And like based on my notes about this other person, it seems like they're trying to paint a crazy picture right now. So let's turn this boat around.
Yeah, I think like I definitely think in the future before I have conversations, before I go on, I'll ask them. I'll be like, what is objective here? Like, I'll have my earphone. Give me a second. I'm so clumsy. I'll definitely be like, I'll straight up ask him, what is objective here? Or if we're going to argue, like, what is the specifics? Because I feel like a lot of times I go on there as well without like I guess what we're talking about, like as a conversation, but a conversation without a clear objective. And then that just turns into a muddled argument because there is no clear objective. And then we get lost in the crosshairs.
Yeah. Yeah. And at least with your own viewer base, you'll be able to explain why things went bad if things go bad too. Like once you have the notes and your stated goals and whatever, like it's much more clear like what went wrong in a conversation too. Like you could come back and be like, whoa, guys, like we definitely went in there to do this, and then he was not letting us do that at all. Like he kept pulling it in this weird direction. Um, yeah, because sometimes that ends up being the case too, and you end up stumbling on things that like were not at all the intended purpose of your discussion, but end up being like the major problem that's actually going on. Like in both my most recent talk with Destiny and a talk I had with Aiden Wood, this happened where it's like, oh, okay, when we started to actually go into the problems and I'm trying to paint a picture of what's going on with the other person, it's like there's this weird like amorphous energy that's kind of leading to all of the I don't want to call them emotions necessarily, but they're leading to everything else. Like there's an experience or other problems that are bubbling under the surface that are like not things I could diffuse. And then once that becomes clear through the questions, like then I can go back to chat and be like, well, we we went in there to do this, but you know, it didn't work because this happened. And like as we because the other thing is you're taking an approach not a lot of people are taking. I keep saying this, but like to
No, that's true. It's
yeah.
frustrating. It's so frustrating because it makes you feel like you're alone, and it makes you feel crazy also because it's like, oh no, they're being a slippery snake, and it's like no, like I have clear opinions and I will be more than happy to state them, but I am trying to reach an actual understanding here. I'm not here for the dunks. It takes me so long for somebody to get me so angry that all I want to do is like dunk on them. Like it takes me like over like a week of nonstop harassment for me to break that reaching point. But then if you're not like that, I think people view it as a sign of weakness, and that's worrying to me.
Mm, yeah, they do. I hope it gains popularity. And maybe you can be one of the people that starts having like more success with this approach, and maybe more people open their eyes to it. Because I think people can, once they understand what you're doing, I think they start to get on board with it a lot more. So another big part of this is distinguishing yourself from the other people whose incentives are completely different. Like this is something I've tried to start doing at the beginning of every talk I have with people if it's not going to be a debate, just like telling them, hey, look, like please understand that my whole purpose here is going to be to like agree with you on something. So this may be different than what you're used to. Like I am on your team for this one. I'm hearing you out on everything. I am taking notes, and like the whole purpose of that entire exercise is to figure out where we could possibly agree and how I can present arguments in a way that are going to be best suited to you. So like, you know, making that clear in some way from the get-go, either from the kinds of questions you're asking or like the anecdotes or asides that you do, like if you ask a question they think it's weird, or like they respond and they're like positive about anything, like you're a good listener, or you're this or you're that, or like you know, they just finish an answer and you leave a long pause, then you can be like, you know, it may seem like a weird question. I'm just asking these because I'm trying to figure out where you're at with stuff, and where that we can go from there. Like little things like that can start to make other people tune in to the way that you're talking and realize that it's different. I think a lot of people are going to be repulsed by the idea of not coming on here to argue, but I hope
How
they
dare
come
you
around
not
to
give
it.
the spicy content? How dare you not start drama?
Yeah. It's really difficult. It's difficult. And it sucks that it's not something other people do. Because, like you said, it makes you feel crazy because you're like, well, why am I doing it like this? Like, this is how you would talk in normal life. Like, Destiny kept saying for the advice I was giving it, this is probably going to work 90% of the time in real life, but it just doesn't work on here. And it's like, well, that's frustrating. Like, there's no way it just doesn't work on here. It's like you have to like change the approach, I guess, when you're surrounded by people whose incentive structure is completely different, who they're here to be entertaining and they're here to like argue about stuff. An argument actually has value to them. And it's like, well, what do you do when somebody is valuing the argument? It's like, well, you have to like replace the candy that's in the hand of that baby with something else. Like one thing I've compared it to is like the baby sucking their thumb, and like that's not ideal. It would be preferable to have a pacifier. So if we can't like get rid of the habit altogether, at least moving to a pacifier might be better. So at least giving them something else, a different version of whatever they're steaming about might be better.
Yeah. I think like it kind of like worries me, and it's like a reason why like I go on and off Twitch a lot. Like I love Twitch and I love streaming, but then I get like so burnt out by this type of like that type of culture. And then I have to like leave for a while because it's like, oh my god, like this type of culture is like so overwhelming, and I feel like I'm not actually creating change. And it's really worrying because I feel like when you have arguments like that, that's like kind of like I guess like showy or flashy, or like for the dunks and stuff. I feel like people aren't actually thinking about what you're saying. They're just listening. I'm trying to think about how to say it the best way. They're hearing what you're saying, but they're not actually thinking through it. But they see the results that you get by dunking on the person or by being flashy to the person. So then they use it when talking to other people. And it's like, great. Like maybe like on the online sphere, that's awesome and everything. But it makes you think like, okay, there's like a whole bunch of people that aren't thinking through their arguments, are going to try to like use this in real life, and then they're just going to come off as like assholes and not necessarily like change the mind of like their family members, or and you know, like not saying that you're going to be able to change anybody's mind, but it's this whole idea that the words that we have an impact towards other people, and other people internalize that and bring that towards another larger sphere outside of ourselves. Does that make sense?
So if I could try to reword it. So basically like are you saying that there's value in people taking the way that people communicate and then using it in their own life, or the ideas, or is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yeah, what I'm trying to get at here is that I think that I'm gonna try to rephrase.
No problem. Sorry.
I think that no, it's okay. I'm learning how to rephrase better, anyways. I think there is value in different forms of praxis. I think there is definitely value and like good things from like a flashy style of debate, but it also worries me in a sense that like that conversational type of debate doesn't seem to be something like very practiced or something that people are very interested in. Because like, yes, that flashy style of debate will definitely convince some people, but it makes me wonder, like, in the broader scope of things, and people who are like, you know, somewhat moderate, or people who have just misaligned beliefs, if you take that approach with them, people who aren't like bad faith people necessarily, they're just raised differently or have had a different set of experiences in life that have brought them to like this completely different conclusion. And you know, they're, let's say theoretically, they're not filled with hate, they're just like, you know, apathetic or not like super well informed. Then I wonder, if you take that style of debate, is it just going to push them away from politics? Is it just going to like make them shut down or disinterested? And they're just things that I worry about, I guess.
Yeah. Like if these streamers in the panels themselves get fatigued and need to take a bunch of time off, like what effect does this have on the viewers? Like, do we have a bunch of viewers who like are becoming apathetic about politics in general because of like the level of discussion they see online, or do they become more entrenched in awful positions because of it? Like it, yeah, feeling like if everybody just communicated in a more empathic way, that we could actually diffuse a lot more radicalism and like handle these topics in a way better way. I definitely agree. Um, like, man, yeah, I feel you, Pixie. Now that I know that you approach things really similarly, when I analyze my own stuff, I'll take notes, and like if I think of anything for you, I'm definitely going to like reach out and let you know for sure, because this totally changes how I thought the conversation was going to go. Because if this is your approach, I do agree, and I am really saddened that it's not everybody. And they don't like it a lot. And like since joining, I've had to like compromise and think of like, well, what are the most wholesome ways that I could give them advice to do their entertaining debate stuff. And I've been trying to do that, but like, damn, if I could find more people that argue like you and just prop you guys up, that would be a heck of a lot better.
My heart, it's becoming so warm. I'm not used to people complimenting me like that. Or, oh, thank you so much. This conversation is honestly making me feel better, because I feel like, I don't know, there are definitely things I have to improve on. Obviously, I'm not perfect, and you've given me really, really good advice that I can use in the future. But it just gets, there's like just this whole tidal wave of hate against me, I feel, so often online. And it's because of these flaws, but I also think it's because the style of debate in general is just something that people don't like.
Yeah.
People just, you know, they want you to take like a really hard stance and like defend it till the death. And you know, just like dunk on the other person. And when you don't do that, estoy en call. Cierra la puerta con Twitch. Okay, sorry. That was my dad. So yeah, so I forgot where I was going. So yeah, so since you're not being like super duper flashy and like super duper like extra and dunking and everything, like it just, you know, you come off weak. People think that you're stupid or that you're crazy, or they come off with this extremely wrong impression of you. So it makes me really happy when I feel like somebody understands me. Like I feel like, okay, like maybe I'm not 100% speaking in hieroglyphics.
Yeah, yeah, not at all. I actually I feel like I have an intuitive understanding of how you're approaching things, because I really do feel like it's super similar to how I do it. Yeah. So I'll just give you a rundown of like the basics, and we'll see like how much we align on this. That this may be a better exercise. So the entire time that I'm listening in a debate, all that I'm trying to do is paint pictures using the pieces that the other person is giving me. So I'm almost entirely focused on them, because I feel like, and you may feel this too, I have a really intuitive understanding of my own perspective. Like I don't feel like I need to waste like almost any like of my brain power on thinking about my position until it comes time to like put all their pieces together and figure out how I respond to it. So the entire time somebody else is talking, I try to give that my 100%, and I just completely leave looking for opportunities to speak at the door. And I don't start thinking about that until I have enough notes written down that like it becomes apparent by looking at my notes, like, oh, okay, you're saying this, this, and this. And like, oh, I see where this can go from here. And then I'll jump into it, but not until I have enough of a footing to like start an argument. And then at any point that I feel like, hold up, where are we going with this? Then I will just like take a step back, ask a question that's like getting at the heart of what I don't understand about them, instead of maybe what I don't understand about the conversation or about the position or anything like that. Just like I ask them a question that they personally can answer uniquely to them based on my notes, and then I let them roll with that for a bit while I consider like, okay, like hopefully this gives me more info so I can paint a better picture and we can continue with this. Like I think everybody has like a map, and they're trying to draw like this surface that's underneath it. And some people put mountains where I think there should be valleys, and other people like put roads through deserts that I think are like impossible. And so, you know, most people agree, oh, okay, over here there's a desert, so we're all going to draw a desert on the map. And a few people are drawing mountains, and like you got to help the people with mountains. Like why the fuck are you drawing mountains
Yeah.
right there?
Wait,
Um
I have a quick question
sure.
before I forget it. It relates to this as well. So yeah, I totally understand what you're saying, and I also feel really similarly of like trying to refrain from putting your position until you like completely understand the other person's, or until you can get like all those base questions down. Um, do you think I'll come out as Weasley or Snaky if you know? Because I feel like this happens with Destiny a lot. Like I start by asking some questions, and but then he asks me a question, and then I respond, and now like suddenly like I'm talking about my position right then and there, but I don't even have the base questions out. So do you think
Mm.
saying something like, "Oh, like I don't want to answer questions right now. I just want to ask them," or how do I phrase this to come off of the way of I'm not trying to avoid everything, or I'm not trying to like hide away. I just really want those building blocks down, or I really want you to answer my line of questioning because, and I guess
Mm.
like the under thing, right? The underlying thing is because eventually like I'm going to use that line of questioning to try to convince you of my opinion. Like how do you
Mhm.
do that without, I guess, looking like really bad optically?
Yeah. So when they're asking for that, they're asking you like for the purpose of the debate, or are they asking you like your perspective or like to say your point so that they can attack it, or like
Yeah,
which of
yeah, my
those?
perspective, my point to like
Hmm.
start attacking it. And it's like, okay, but I first want to get the basics down.
Yeah, so you can say like a longer phrase that's maybe 3 to 4 sentences long, and as long as even one of those sentences hinted at your perspective, people tend to accept it. So the way that this could look if somebody asked you that, like we could use the Destiny conversation in specific, like, okay, Pixie, like I'm having you on here, like, so what's up? How do you think we're gonna fix this? Oh fuck, like now I'm on the spot. Okay, so like, I would give one sentence, one or two that kind of give enough to like show where I'm coming from. Like, well, I think first of all, we need to identify these big problems that are like fairly evident in the police departments, and create solutions that are actually going to fix those. And but my problem is that I've seen you do X, Y, and Z, and I want to kind of understand your perspective on this, that, and the other thing. And usually people will let that go because you gave them enough of your position. Like, oh, okay, so she's like kind of anti-police, and then they just like that's all that they need to know, and then they're willing to answer your questions after that. So I think what they're looking for when they ask you that is actually really, really small. Like they're okay with anything, even like a sentence that gives your position. And then you can easily include 3 to 4 other sentences that explain your purpose in the conversation, which is to understand them, or point at a general like misunderstanding about their perspective. Because that's another big trigger for debate people to then start going into like all their points and whatever, is if you show that you don't understand their position, or even worse, that you have a misunderstanding of their position, then they'll start definitely going into whatever their thing is. So that's a really good way of like just giving them enough, and then making sure you give them something they can put their teeth into, and start the whole conversation. So that's how I would handle that.
Okay, I'll definitely keep that in mind because I think that's the number one thing that derails me. That they ask me a question and then I go like maybe too much into a long-winded answer or something, and then we're going back and forth on that question, and I never even finished my first line of questioning, which I guess like they do get frustrated, which is completely understandable because I go through like ideally if I can I go through really long line of questioning because I want to get like everything, like I
Yeah.
want to I want to get it all down.
Mm. And I think for some people, when they see nothing but questions and they don't see any arguments, that's like a trigger for them to ask about this, right?
Yeah, for sure.
So, one thing that's easy to do is when you ask somebody a question and they give you an answer, to word back the answer in a way that's going to help your argument later. And this brings it back to like knowing what your overall argument or your overall purpose here is going to make it a lot easier to form those replies. So, like, if you ask him a question about like reforming or abolishing the police, and he gave a lot of pushback on that, and they say like, oh, like, um, I think that's an awful idea. I don't think you should do that at all. Like, I don't think you understand how the funding of the police department works. Like, all this stuff. Like, like wording back their answer to them is a really good way to then appear like you're posing an argument, and then like giving a little bit of your position, like how you personally would feel or respond to that, your opinion on it. So like, okay, so I'm hearing you that like what you would prefer us to do is you would prefer us to reform things from within the police department, and you think it's more than reasonable that we could just vote in new chiefs until we find one who's economically responsible, right? Yeah, that's basically it. Okay. And I completely agree. Like, if we were able to do that, I just worry about all the other places that haven't had this happen and like whatever. And then later on in the conversation, when he goes into voter apathy, you could be like, well, hold on, because before you had said that like you think that voting has to be the number one way, and that like we have to vote and fix like who's elected in all of these positions. But like if voter apathy is this much of a problem, it doesn't seem those people are reflecting are reflecting the constituents. Like, if that's the case, does that bother you at all, or does that change your position on that at all? Like, would your advice for these people change if we understand voter apathy is a big obstacle to actually having the will of the people reflected in this? Because he can't just go
Yeah.
back at that point and say like, well, this is the whole point, is that voter apathy, and if the people don't go out, then fuck them. The people aren't going to reflect them because they're not their constituency. Like, hold up. Now it feels like you're looping. Now it feels like you're repeating yourself. So I've forced you to kind of restructure your argument because I framed that problem already in what I've said. So if you say your whole spiel again, it's going to sound like you're repeating yourself, and it's way easier to dismiss that. And then you're in a position where you get to gatekeep what that response is. And if it's not good enough, you've put yourself in a position with how you ask that question that it's a lot easier to have that power play. So that might be one way you could do it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that does make sense. And like I think I that was like that's also like a really good catch that you gave me there. That I didn't like realize before. Like, hey, you know what? Like, that's true. Like, if you think voter apathy is like a huge problem, and you're saying, oh, we just got to like vote in new chiefs, like chief after chief after chief, like that probably is going to contribute to voter apathy as well. So like, you just end up like in a non-ending loop. Like, how do you? But then his answer to it is like, oh, of course they won't do that. But then the theoretical question is like, if like
Hmm.
people do go against the constituents, it's not 100% unique. Like, you do, if like I could probably find like a list of politicians that have voted against what their general constituents want. I think not she's a Democrat. She's in the north. I think it's New Jersey or Maine. Susan Collins, I believe. I believe that's her name. She has constantly gone against her constituents, and that's an
Hmm.
example in the Senate. We're not talking about local legislator, so it's not like an incredibly like out there hypothetical or anything like that. It is something that happens. Um, so yeah, that's definitely a good catch I should have brought up that I'll keep in mind for the future. Um,
Yeah,
but
but
I
the
mhm.
the general structure of that though might be more helpful to note than like the particular, because the particular example feels a lot like, oh, with hindsight we can go back and make a million good arguments, but like I think putting yourself in a position where you ask a question that inside of it has what the other person just told you forces them out of a loop, because if they repeat themselves again, you can easily like checkmate them right there. You can like put them in an awkward position, and so that's like a stranglehold in the conversation that can really help you to get out of like, and this isn't to say that he was being bad faith, but this can get you out of bad faith spots if people start repeating themselves, or if people are keep referring back to a point that you don't want them to continue referring back to. By doing that, you put them in a position where they have to give a different reason, or they have to rethink their other positions, of which this was like a critical point, right? And so any other arguments they had that use this thing, because that's like the key in the stranglehold, you're forcing them to then give you more information that you can more positively agree with them about later, right? Like you're just looking for more points because obviously, you're not given enough yet. Like, okay, with just this voter apathy thing, I don't quite have enough. I would like to have more points. So like if I can take this one out, if I can force you to think outside of this one, what else do you give me? And that might just be the next stepping stone you need to continue that conversation. Or at the very least, like it puts brakes on it in a way that like will help you catch your breath. It'll help you reframe things. Like it gives you a pivot point to where you could do a lot of other stuff. And it's just kind of their move on where they go, but you've restricted it in a way where they can't repeat themselves again.
Yeah, I'll definitely keep that in mind in the future. That's really good advice. Um, yeah, absolutely. I might ask you. I obviously I should do this. This is my homework, right? Like I should put the burden of evidence on you. But if you have or maybe I should just like take notes right now. I don't know because I'm like I'm listening and I'm trying to learn. And I know if I take notes, I won't remember, and then I might not go back to my notes later on just because I'll forget because I'm gonna blame it on the ADHD because that's what I always do. Slash, it's true. But yeah, do you have I think and not even just for me, I think you should publish these ideas online if you haven't already. I think they'd be really useful, especially for people who are interested in starting to debate on Twitch, because this is really awesome advice.
I'm just happy it's helpful. I always worry that I'll go into one of these conversations and just be completely stumped. Like I felt really bad earlier when I didn't have an answer to if people are putting you in a bad faith situation, how to solve it, or what do you do about the optics problem of taking the agreement approach? Like these are harder problems. I always worry that the conversation is going to be a bunch of them, but I'm happy this one I was able to help you.
Yeah, no. And hello, nobody's gonna have all the answers of how to debate perfectly in Twitch, and there's never going to actually be an all of answers version of that because you're gonna get fucked no matter what you do. That's just the reality of it. People will always find something to dislike about you, no matter how perfectly you try to execute something. But yeah, no, you've given really solid advice for sure.
Dang. Okay. Well, I mean, I'll consider it. Maybe after I get to talk to more people, I'll be able to figure out. Oh, okay, these are the biggest things. For the people that are really good at debate, this is another thing. I don't know if it might help you because you do a lot of debates too. But this idea that there's a divide between novices and experts, that this veil of ignorance that stands between them can make understanding them really, really difficult. So if you have spent hours and hours and hours researching police reform and this and that and the history of race and all of this kind of stuff, and then you talk to a normie who has none of that, it can be really hard to put your brain back to the point where you didn't have any of the info that you have and to think from the perspective of somebody who knows nothing about what you're talking about. The approach has to be different. You have to start from a blank slate and figure out what are the core ideas that lead to this idea or this understanding or this argument, and you have to work from there. That's something that not a lot of people are doing. The way that Destiny reworded it in my conversation with him is it's you're in front of the jury and you're meant to make a case for them. They're not allowed to have used outside information or anything else, so you're expected to present all of the evidence in the correct order in the best possible way to paint the case, and that anything you leave out, the jury can't use. And so you have to be very particular about what information is available to everybody in the room. And so throughout a conversation, remembering that a lot of the viewers may not know everything. They may not know about your own drama. They may not know who you are or your approach or yada, yada, all of these things. They lead to so many misunderstandings about the people and their arguments that I feel if you would have just taken that into account moving into it, you could have changed your tact and your approach to better get across your ideas by taking those novices into consideration in the way that you talk about stuff.
Yeah. Usually I don't have much of a problem. I feel when I'm arguing with novices, I consider myself a novice, because of the conversational approach is specific. Because since you're starting from trying to understand what the other person thinks before you argue, or how the other person thinks or what they value, it's not, what is it? It becomes a lot easier to understand like what points you have to attack. The only part, like, is the only thing that's a lot harder is now when you're debating with people who already have experience debating on Twitch in that specific style. They're not interested in conversational approach, so it'll do whatever that can happen to not go that way.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's more a problem for other people that get so involved in their own arguments that they like fail to see how other people misunderstand them. I don't think that's necessarily like always a problem for you, but I thought maybe just mentioning it, you might be able to fit it into some other issues, because when I've explained that to some other people, they've been like, "Oh, okay, like hold on, that sounds like all these other problems I'm having." And like to give you some of my like personal background that might help to understand where any of this is coming from, because I see people doing like the who in the chat. So like I help people with their graduate papers, like professionally. That's what I do, is I help people write and publish books, and then I help them with writing their graduate papers. So if they're getting a master's or a doctoral and they need to submit a paper, I can write the whole thing from scratch and do it for them, or help them with the editing and tutoring on that. So arguments and logic and the appeals and all that stuff is kind of like bread and butter for that, and so it just seems to apply really weirdly to Twitch.
If you don't mind me asking, what did you major in?
Oh, I didn't actually do any more than like a semester.
Oh my God, but you work on people's graduate papers for a living.
Yeah. Well,
That's
since I was
dope.
I had been writing papers since I was a senior in high school for people. Like that's when I finished my first graduate paper. So basically, and I had been taking online classes for people for like quite some time. So when I went to college, I was like, oh, this isn't very fun. And it's really, really expensive.
I just like writing papers instead.
Yeah, I kind of just like writing the papers. I don't seem to need the degree for it. So it hasn't been too bad so far.
Yeah, I like writing a lot more than I like what is it? I like writing or oral classes a lot more than I like just like normal test classes. So I cheat on my syllabuses in the sense that I look for the ones that have just writing essays, and then I'm like, this is what I'm gonna take.
Yeah. But yeah, so just because I saw people asking, I know I don't do like a million debates or anything. I'm gonna try to do more, but anywho, sorry, back to your stuff. I'm so sorry, I'm getting sidetracked.
No. I love learning about new people. Oh my God, no, don't apologize. No, I love having conversations with other people and like learning more about where they come from. And conversational is, you know what I mean? You get me, whatever. Even though yeah. I'm totally freaking out with wording.
I'm just super happy I found another person who argues this way, because God, it has been exhausting being like one of the only people. Fuck. Like so many people like argument, and I'm like, well, like step one for me is keep everything at like a low tension level, and like you kind of throw that out the window with your style almost immediately. Like how do I it's like a different way of approaching things, like, and very different from like anything that you would do IRL. Like IRL, if you have any of these conversations, there's no way you would be like arguing going into it and expect it to work out well. So it's like it's tough to get my head around.
My family members, a lot of them are like very conservative, right wing, everything like that, and I take a conversationalist approach to them as well. I always try to do like conversation, and I have a cousin who gets like really angry, like, you know, straight up like argumentation, super hardcore, and I think like obviously I haven't seen like straightforward progress yet. It's only been in like the last 2 years where I've really like, or last year really, where we've like met enough where I can really focus on a conversationalist approach. And I think like I've had a lot more effect on them than just a straight up like argumentation screaming. So we'll see where that goes. That'll be a case study I'll update you on.
Yeah. And what I'm telling some other people who are more empathic, kind of like the flavor of talking that we like to do, for those people, I've been telling them, like, it may be okay to adopt a different kind of approach for different sorts of scenarios. Like on panel shows, I don't see how you could make this work at all, Pxie. Like, I don't know. I would be interested to see how you do that, because you have to talk over people and you have to be angry. And if you don't call people out, like, it's not fun. And like...
I'm
Ugh.
very I don't speak as much as I should in panel shows. Like a lot of people say that I'm like pretty quiet or whatever. For that reason exactly.
Mm.
I don't like talking over people as well.
Sorry, I'm responding to your chat a little bit.
Oh, it's okay. Like I love my chat, but at the same time, if I'm with somebody in a call, I'm just so bad at responding with chat at the same time. I can only focus on one thing. Like I can only hyper focus. Which, now that I noticed it, thank you, Racer X 250 for subbing to me. That is quite appreciated. I am so sorry. I did not thank you for your sub when you did it a while ago. I was distracted. Oh, I
Yeah.
was talking. I was having conversations. So thank you.
I hold your chat in very high regard because I see the relationship you have with them from like the other streams I've stopped in on. Like it is incredible that you still go through all of them and respond to them like equally. Like holy crap. So that's the only reason why I'm like really trying to respond to who I feel is asking honest questions in the chat.
Oh yeah, my chat is my baby. I'm like, oh my god, you guys spent so much time. Well, not even so much time, but whatever. You spent time to actually write down here to talk to me. Like, damn. Like, I want to respond to that. Like, I like that.
Even if sometimes I think they're spinning your wheels, I do find them endearing, and that relationship is really really cute. So I like seeing you interact with the chat like that. It's cool.
Yeah, they're not that bad.
Was there was there anything else from that conversation in particular, or any questions generally you had that you wanted me to go through?
Not that I can think of the top of my mind, right now. I guess like generally, like if you had to pick one thing, what would be the biggest thing I have to focus on right now? Like if I like the top thing on the list, if you can find it.
A much better understanding of like the larger logical level that people are at. So like the bigger steps that they're using to reach their conclusions. And I think that this is something that note taking could like very easily solve. So I'm not too concerned about it moving forward, but that would be a big thing. Cause like if you're taking this empathic approach, the notes are really going to help you get like a better picture for what the other person is thinking, because it's like it's so aliens a lot of the time to put yourself in the head of the other person, because a lot of the time the points are tough to put together. Like that's why I really have to rely on notes, because otherwise like those thoughts don't logically click the way they do for other people in my own head. So I definitely need the notes for that. So I think if you do the notes, this problem will solve itself. But like you get a lot of insights when you have a better understanding for like all the steps the other person is coming to. Another interesting remember word thing that I put in my notes, and this is advice I got when I was young, and it's been super duper helpful, is to write down the words that people repeat. Write down the words that you notice either they put a lot of emphasis on or that they repeat, because it tells you a lot about the person. And if you can use those in your communication back to them, it can make a lot of your ideas more palatable. Like I'm okay with leaning into the accent that I have living in Orange County, because your accent is obviously already there and you have a similar accent. So I'm okay with and like I'm letting that go a lot more than I normally would. But like,
Yeah, people get so mad at the like and the right.
yeah. Or like dude and chick. I've learned that chick is something people really don't like, and I've had to work really hard not to use that, but I think I'm doing better. There's been a lot of learning curves to coming on here. But anyways, yeah. Taking notes of like the words the other people repeat, taking notes in general so you have like a snapshot of where they're coming from, because you'll see larger like, oh, okay, he's going from this to this to this, or like, oh, this person keeps repeating rights. So they're one of those people that only cares about like constitutional rights. So I'm probably going to have to take like an amendment approach to this. Or like, oh, okay, he's constantly repeating like voter apathy. So maybe that's the biggest thing here. Or like, like every time I try to ask him a question about this, he responds with this. And though I don't think that that's an adequate answer to the question I asked, it does give me some more information about what he cares about. So if I'm going to ask different different questions 3 different times, but he's going to give me basically the same logical point as an answer. They're forcing you into dealing with that logical point. So it's either you move around it or like figure out what else it's attached to, or you have to diffuse it then and there. So like if voter apathy is the constant answer to everything, and not that it was in that debate, again, I'm just like trying to use something relevant, then you know you have to diffuse that first. And writing down the words that repeat can be super helpful for that and easier to think of on the fly.
Yeah. Well, I think that's it for now. I can't think of anything more to add on to it. But this has been a super good conversation. This has been super insightful. I'm really happy we had it.
I'm happy to be of help.
Yeah. Do you like shout yourself out? Like let the world know.
I'm Book Smarts on Twitch. My name is Noah. You're always welcome to call me Noah. Basically, I do talks like these with people. I try to help them through like communication hurdles they're going through, or oftentimes like how they're coming out in debates or in panels or in arguments, and then figuring out like why the audience interpreted it a certain way, or why it turned dramatic, or why it's not working, or how you can improve, or like all these different things. Like they've kind of covered the spectrum. Like I told you before, I talked to Aiko Rules about like arguing with OCD and with ADHD, like that presents some unique problems. And so going through what her experiences were and how she would solve them was really interesting for me. Like I learned a lot from that conversation, and I felt like I was able to do a lot of good. And now she's getting super on top of note-taking. Like if you want an app recommendation, I don't know if you've heard of it, but Notion is really good. So if you end up going down the route of note-taking, that's a digital one, and it has a lot of features for like nesting bullets, so that like you can have toggles where you click it and it'll hide everything that's like underneath that bullet point.
Oh, that's good, because when I OneNote or whatever, I get really like overwhelmed. I'm really messy note taker, so being able to like hide it like layers is super good for me.
Yeah, for me that was a game changer, because it similarly, like once you're like 10 or 12 points deep, it's like, oh, hold on, this doesn't help me anymore because I can't understand what's going on at all at a glance. But like if you're taking notes and then you can put them under like nested toggles, then it's like, oh, okay, like there's 3 different types of ideas or arguments here. It's this kind, this kind, and this kind. Like, oh, okay, now the argument's way more clear. Like now I know how to address this person, whatever. So Notion's really, really good. Anywho, so I give advice like this. I'm Book Smarts on Twitch. I help people with communication.